Hi all to those who are just joining us for another conversation during this festival, the Hindu Women's Festival 2021. As I'm sure you've encountered a number of great, insightful conversations over the last few days, and here's another. I'm Bhavin Tailor, based in West London, Deputy Head Teacher, and with me today, I've got Jaspreet Kaur Sharma. Jazz is based in Slough, I believe. Jazz, is that correct? Yeah,
Yeah,
and
that's
is a
correct.
management consultant in the London area. Just a bit of background here, actually. Jazz and I met over 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago. Jazz had joined the Tattva's authorship program, and I had just joined as a mentor. And the purpose of that was to guide and almost be a critical friend to Jazz as she toiled with a number of areas of topics that she then ended up writing about. I am honoured, really, to not only have this conversation with Jazz again, because based upon what she has written, it's now also as an ebook. Some of that thinking is still resonating and still being spoken about 2 years later, hence this discussion now. This is the book, by the way. Tipping Points was a collection of those essays, and Jazzy's work is in there. So I'm not going to just say too much. I'm going to hand over to Jazz in a minute, who can tell us a little bit more about this. So Jazz, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. Let's go straight into it, Jazz. So like I said, we met 2 years ago when you were thinking about this notion of femininity, feminism, tradition, womanhood. And then you wrote a very insightful piece called Women, Tradition and India. Why that?
So I guess the concepts, like you've spoken of, womanhood and feminism have always been topics that I've been super interested in, have been quite close to my heart and close to my experiences. This particular topic was quite interesting because I have had many instances in my life which have made me think that there are certain parts of the British Indian woman's experience that needs a bit more unpicking and exploring. And I think a good example of that is when I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, so very, very young. And I remember my grandma basically praying to have a grandson. And I was a bit baffled, to be honest, because I was thinking, okay, it's very interesting that it's particularly a grandson when obviously she has a granddaughter because I'm there, and it wasn't about even having a healthy grandchild. It was very specific in wanting a grandson, and that kind of stayed with me because I think that kind of almost for a lot of people sets a framework in their head of, okay, so having a grandson seems like it's quite it's what's wanted, and having a granddaughter seems like we'll put up with it, if that makes sense.
Yes,
and
yes.
that always like stayed with me in terms of what that actually means for my identity and who I am and where I fit into our cultural framework. So that was quite an interesting part or a memory from childhood that really sparked off this whole notion of what it actually means to be a woman of Indian heritage in whichever country, and what that experience is like, and also kind of what that means for our culture in our society and what it says about our the way we speak about gender and how that translates to our traditions as well. So that I guess that was like the first example in terms of the broad topic.
I mean,
But
Jazz,
then,
can I just say, so to interrupt you, I mean, that's phenomenal from such an early age that you were questioning notions of language that determine how we shape our actions and our thinking. Can I just ask, did you ever question her at the time?
it's really interesting because I didn't actually question my grandma. I questioned my mum, and I said to my mum, grandma's asking for a grandson. Like, why does she want a grandson? I don't understand. And I remember her saying to me, she said, people of a certain generation she said people your grandparents' age, they like having grandsons because they carry on the name. So she used it as it basically carries on the names, but it's nothing you need to worry about because you can do anything that a grandson can do. So she was quite good in that way in saying that. But I always found that interesting because I used to think to myself, it can't just be about the name. It can't be just be about, you know, carrying on a name. So I did question it, but I think it's really interesting because you get to a certain age almost and you stop questioning it because it becomes so entrenched in the thinking of, oh yeah, so in Indian society or in Indian culture there are certain things that are almost kind of in the framework of what a son is and what a daughter is, and there are certain roles that the son takes on and there are certain roles that the daughter takes on. Not to say that that hasn't changed or that hasn't transformed over the years or anything like that, but I think it's almost implicit. Well, it definitely is for me and a lot of my friends who are Indian, essentially.
I mean, before we go further into the essay, which I know I've read a number of times, and like I said, it's like 2 years old now, but based upon the experiences today of your peers, of your friends, do you still see that happening now, where if someone's having a child, they say, oh, we want a boy because, or is it not as common?
I would say I don't think it's as overt as it used to be. So I do think it's still a little bit generational. So I do think that potentially from my grandparents' age, you know, I think there's probably still comments around if someone's having a baby, you know, oh, is it going to be a boy? Is it going to be a girl? And I think there is some implicit messaging around it being a grandson versus a granddaughter. I think the conversation has changed for my generation, definitely, because I think, you know, now a lot of, you know, women my age, we have careers. We're not fitting into those traditional roles. However, what I do think is interesting is I do still see, and this is also part of why I wanted to write this, is I do still see a lot of my peers, for instance, who do come from an Indian background, who, when you talk about certain traditions, will say something like, "Oh yeah, but that's really backward," or "Yeah, but you know, that's quite regressive, isn't it?" Or "That feels quite oppressive." And I used to have, you know, kind of make those sweeping statements too, without really knowing kind of the background or where those traditions have come from or how it's come to be as it is today, and how that narrative has come to be. So I think that's quite interesting, because I think there's still a lot of people our age who, although they go through the motions of traditions. I take a really good example of, like, when I was getting married, there's so many traditions that come with marriage. And I would ask my mom, my husband would ask his parents, why do we do this? And nobody could give us an answer. It was a bit of a, we just do, like, oh, I don't know, like, this is, you know, this is how it is. And, you know, you get some sort of anecdotal evidence of this is why we do things. But I was really trying to get to the core of, you know, how did this start? What does it mean?
Right.
Why am I doing it? Why is it important? And I found that really hard to get an answer for as well. And that kind of, I feel like that example is another element that got me thinking around this whole notion of tradition, what tradition is, what it means, why is it important, does it need to change, and like how it impacts how we
do what we do.
How we do what we do, exactly.
Just can I just say, I mean, it's interesting you make this point about tradition, because I was just going to go on to this. In your piece that you've written, there's a real focus on tradition, and as we've seen over the last few days with this festival, and as we'll see over the next couple of days, there's been a lot of questioning and re-questioning, which isn't bad in itself. And actually, when we do question, we dig deeper into some of these traditions that actually are not as regressive as the Western world may tell us them to be. Can you just tell me, based upon your research that you did for your piece, what is tradition?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question, right? Because I think tradition, when on the surface of it, it's obviously it's rituals that have been carried down and that people take up and do as a, like I said, that there's almost a term of like blindly following tradition.
Okay.
And the term tradition itself and something that is traditional is almost always put in at odds with progress. And so in its nature, it implicitly it implies that there is regression when you talk about tradition. And I think, that can be the case, it can't be the case, but this whole thing of what you just mentioned about questioning it is the most important thing.
Agreed.
Because I think as in our society, if we can't explain where a tradition has come from, how can we defend it, or how can we change it as well if we don't know the nature of it, if we don't know the core of that tradition. And so I think that was a really important point to me. Tradition can mean a whole lot of things to a whole lot of people, and especially in terms of mainstream narrative or kind of what you're taught. A real simple example is, growing up, I always thought, dowry, like what a regressive tradition. Like I can't believe that is something that we still have a conversation about today in terms of marriage, when why is that still a topic? And it's really, really interesting because I came at wanting to research it to almost cement my opinion that it was bad, if that makes sense. Do you know what? Of course it's regressive. Like why would that be a tradition that we'd want to uphold?
Yes.
And then you start doing the research, and it's really interesting, and you start digging a little bit deeper into things, and suddenly you realize that perhaps the narrative that you have come to grow up with, or perhaps the view that you've become accustomed to, is one that perhaps isn't telling the whole story. So so as dowry as an example, so what I learned through my research, which I found so interesting, was there was a time when the kind of tradition of dowry was actually, or could actually have been seen as quite empowering. So actually, when a woman got married and moved into her husband's family, she was often given some money, some land, some possessions that her father passed down. So she came into the marriage with an equal footing. With she was a bit self-sufficient, and she was able to kind of use that as her property, not as her dad's property, not as her husband's property, but as her own. And it wasn't until some laws were passed during when the British were in India that actually prohibited property being handed down from the father to the daughter, that suddenly the whole the kind of the perception of that tradition changed. That's where the switch happened, because no longer could a daughter hold that possession. So even though the tradition might have stayed the same, that possession, those possessions, that money, that land may have then been transferred over to the husband. So you can see from those small shifts that have happened how that has kind of translated. And now we see it as something that's quite oppressive, or quite backward in many ways. But it's really interesting to know that as a tradition, it was actually meant for women to empower women and to actually make sure that they were in a pretty powerful position going into their marriage. So it's stuff like that.
Sorry, I could listen to you forever. That is incredible, because like I said, I only came to learn of this in the research that you did, and obviously in your writing. And it goes back to the point I made earlier, is when we start questioning, only scratching the surface, do we actually come to realize that in the Dharmic and Hindu philosophies and traditions, to use that word, some of those practices which we now in the Western world are told, think, believe to be regressive and oppressive, actually weren't in its outset. That's what the dowry is. So just for those of our viewers who are unfamiliar, dowry is the giving of, on the marriage day, that the bride's family would give to the groom's family. But actually what you're saying is that's not what it was intended for. It was intended for the woman to be empowered. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. It was meant for the bride. It was, yeah, it was her. They were her possessions. They were not her husband's. They were not her, you know, her father's. And it's interesting how that's kind of yeah, transpired today to be something that it
Yeah,
was never intended to be.
tended to be. Because then to
Yeah.
add to that notion of colonialism and how the British added laws, policies that shifted the mindset, which now, decades later, century later, we come to think as being potentially a negative. Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
powerful. And I hope viewers that are watching this now, a penny drops for some of us if we didn't know that, because it definitely did for me a couple of years ago when you shared that with me.
And it did for me when I was doing my research as well, as I said. I think that's the key to this stuff is I think especially for our communities, it's really important to not just go along with what we're told and kind of just accept a narrative or accept that there are parts of our tradition and our upbringing that are kind of regressive or what or negative, or that there has that negative perception, but to actually go and research it for ourselves, because you find out so much about our history is so rich and there is so much kind of beneath the surface, but it's also very misunderstood and it's also very misrepresented. And it's that going back to that thing of actually it's a tradition that does still happen today and does still hold, but actually there is an opportunity there if we wanted to kind of turn the dial and turn the rhetoric around and turn the narrative around to explain to people who are unfamiliar kind of what the values are that our history and our tradition actually aspires to.
Yeah, which is why, I mean, as I said at the beginning, this festival, I think it's incredible on that very reason, because it allows us to question, scratch the surface, to have conversations like this. And like I said, there's thought leaders like yourself who are doing some phenomenal work in all areas and all fields. And having this discussion will allow each and every one of us to get something more than we previously had. And just to add to that, Jazz, in your piece, you talk about assets versus liabilities.
Yeah.
So this notion of commodity and women, the female becoming a commodity. Just explore that for me a little bit.
Yeah, so I think this definitely goes back to that the comment I made earlier about listening to my grandma praying for a son, and I was thinking about that relationship between examining the role in an kind of the nuclear household of an Asian family living in Britain today, and often there's kind of this contrast between son and daughter. And the only way I could really, when I was thinking about it, I probably got with my management consultant head on, is the way I was thinking about it is in terms of commodity, of assets and liabilities. So when thinking about a son, often they're seen as the breadwinner, they're seen as the people that are going to bring something into a family when they get married. Traditionally, they would take care of their parents. Traditionally, they're obviously going to carry on the family name. So in many ways, all of that together kind of has this kind of feeling of having a son in a family is an asset. Whereas with a daughter, it's different, because they obviously there are the pressures of a daughter in terms of one day she's going to leave the family. So that's the first thing. She's going to get married and she's not going to be part of that family anymore. And also often in these traditions, if you think about dowry or if you think about the wedding, it's that they're often seen, daughters are seen as quite expensive, rightly or wrongly. So you're gonna have to pay when your daughter gets married, and they are not the ones that are going to be looking after you in old age. Traditionally, it would be, you know, she'd be looking after her in-laws, for instance. And so it's this idea of her being a liability. There's a lot of hassle that comes with having a daughter, whereas it feels like with a son, you know, there is less hassle when bringing a son up, and it was a really interesting kind of contrast, and I just wanted to explore a little bit around where has that mentality come from, because it seemed at odds with what I knew about my kind of you know, ancient culture, in terms of, you know, we we worship these strong goddesses, would watch films and heard stories. If you think about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and these stories as well, where there were really strong female characters. You had queens that were sort of characters
revered.
within themselves that revered and carried a lot of strength. And so it just seemed a bit at odds with kind of what I felt was actually kind of important in culture. And then that's when you kind of overlay history and you start thinking about how that over centuries and over decades filters down and changes thinking slightly. And it was quite interesting because my husband was also writing at the time, and he was writing about colonialism. And it's when you start thinking about the history of India and the fact that it's had to deal with invasion after invasion after invasion, and what that means for a community and what that means for a society. In fact, the fact is that women were a commodity in those times because they were the ones that were getting kidnapped. They're the ones that could be raped. They're the ones that kind of were almost taken captive. You hear these stories of invaders coming in and wanting the daughter or the queen or whatever that is. So suddenly there is a protectiveness that comes around daughters and women in a society, because there is a feeling that if you're under attack, they're the ones that need protecting. When it comes, and I think that in the context of that, then it becomes slightly clearer as to why the framework that exists now has kind of come into being. And not that it's it's obviously changing because we're in a different world and we're in a different space, but it's kind of up to us to question where that's come from and whether it fits today or whether we need to change it, if that makes sense. So
I mean, Jazz, just to add to that, I mean, I know the piece that you wrote doesn't necessarily do this, and it's a separate conversation. We could speak about it for length, but this connotation of monetary value to gender. And there's some thoughtful research out there, isn't it? I mean, you've alluded to it, the fact that the boy goes out to earn, looks after, and then therefore there's money or monetary value attached to that. Whereas the female, on the other hand, there isn't. So these notions of how each gender is treated is also predetermined by other factors like the economy.
Completely.
Like money.
Completely, yeah. No, and that's like you said, that's a whole different area of topic. But and sort of the roles of kind of staying home and having a family and making a home versus going out and forging a career. And while that has changed for women today, what then does that mean for our place in society and how that links to, like you said, kind of these predetermined factors which now aren't so predetermined as well? If that makes
I mean, this takes us full circle because it almost, I mean, time's going to elude us in a minute, but we end almost where we started with your anecdote from your grandmother who talked about having this grandson. And as you said, you didn't necessarily question her, but your mum tried to appease that conversation. But what's interesting, because I've seen this, is that generation above us, our parents' generation, can't necessarily always explain some of the things that they were told to do. So the question here is, for how many generations will that continue, or does it just fizz out?
Completely. I think that's like a massive point for me is with each generation and each kind of generation that we're removed from our homeland as well, and for each generation that perhaps doesn't kind of know exactly all the traditions, or even I think language is a big thing as well, like as things go on, there's nuances that you get from language that if it's not your mother tongue, you can also get lost in translation. But that's the thing. If my parents can't explain something that my grandparents carried across the water with them, that was passed down from their parents and their parents, the onus really is on kind of my generation and the generations that go after us, is to question, is to do our research, and is to ask the questions. I think that's the most important thing. And it's to as a community, write our own narrative and not accept kind of what's given to us as about who we are. We know who we are. We don't need to be told who we are.
Yeah, and Jazz, I think that's a theme that's come from the last few days, and will continue to with these conversations. This isn't about this, one is right and one is wrong, but as it is, it's about reframing the narrative so that people like ourselves can speak for ourselves, as you've just said.
Completely.
I mean, we are coming to the end here, and I think this is like, so we could spend hours talking about this. And it's probably worth just saying is, a couple of years ago when you and I were, well, you were doing the writing, I was just being that critical friend. You're an English graduate, right?
Well, I'm a linguist.
Yeah, you're a linguist. My background's in philosophy and politics, and I remember us spending a bit of time looking at language and how translations can be missed, or there are no translations for other words. Well, I say no translations. There are not the correct
no direct
one. So we lose meaning
100%,
which is where some of this, when we're trying to mirror or live within the Western world with some of our Dharmic Hindu values, where a conflict potentially comes from. So
definitely.
Jazz, it's been incredible. It's, I think, 25 minutes, and as always, it's been a delight to speak to you. Thank you.
So great to speak to you too.
And like I said, for those of our viewers, Tipping Points was published 2 years ago in 2019, and it's a collection of essays from 4 different writers, and Jazz, and actually her husband is in this as well, isn't he? And
yes, he
so
is,
Jazz's piece on women tradition in India, the one we've just focused on, and like I said, we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more we could have said, but thank you for participating in the festival, and we look forward to seeing much more of you.
Thanks, thank you so much.
No worries. Have a good day. Thanks to our viewers again. And like I said, please continue to engage with the debates, the discussions. Jazz is on social media. If there's any questions, please do ping. I'm sure she'll be happy to keep this conversation alive and continue following the festival for the next day or so. Bye-bye.